Hello, this is Georgina Rose.
This is Anthony.
This is IAO131.
And welcome to Magnolias and Magic. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a sort of discussion that begins with Thelema, but I think actually applies in a lot of spaces. So, for the non-Thelemites listening, or the Thelemites listening, at the end of the Book of the Law, Aleister Crowley has this little thing called the Comment. And the comment reads as follows. The study of this book is forbidden. It is wise to destroy this copy after the first reading. Whoever so disregards this does this at his own risk and peril. These are most dire. Those who discuss the content of this book are to be shunned by all as centers of pestilence. All questions of the law are to be decided only by appeal to my writings, each for himself. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. And so the Thelemic community has a very mixed response to this. Some people, which I honestly fall into this camp, sort of disregard the comment or interpret it as there's quite a few takes that people have on it or like what it might mean, whereas other people take it very, very seriously. And if you're sort of discussing the Book of the Law anywhere online, you will get the reply guys going, the comment, read the comment. And so this, I think, actually connects to a sort of larger thing in the occult community because in the comment, there's this whole thing about it's only be decided by appeal to my writings, each for himself, which in wider spirituality, there's this strong tendency in modern spiritual movements that is essentially, in probably the most cursed way to say it, everything is valid, or that every spiritual path is entirely true, never question anything. And I think that is something that really terminates our ability to discuss the theologies and the concepts that we're talking about because we're so worried on stepping on someone else's toes. This is very clear in Thelema whenever the Book of the Law comes up, or honestly, a lot of ideas about Thelema come up. They're like, well, we all have our own interpretations. And I think to an extent, that's actually a sort of important thing. We don't want to be, super orthodoxic. But in a way, I think we're creating a new rigid orthodoxy by saying that we can't have a more critical discussion about what we're consuming or to actually debate with each other to some extent because everyone can decide everything on their own. And I think that that is something that can really stop discussion. It begins with the Book of the Law, but I think that that's something that we see cross-communally. So let's break into it.
Okay, so I'm gonna take the reins on this because I am the resident non-Thalemite today since Nike is not here. So can you both of you or either of you give me a little context on like what the Book of the Law is and like where that falls in the scope of Thelema?
Is this me? Yeah, I can do that.
Sure.
So, the Book of the Law is basically the central text of Thelema.
Okay.
So it was received by Crowley in 1904. Received is the word used because he believes it was, as he says, it was dictated to him by Aiwas, basically an angel of sorts. Personally, I think this is essentially a direct parallel to Gabriel dictating the Quran to Muhammad, right?
Okay.
So in my view, it's actually primarily a religious text in that way. But Crowley, obviously, and lots of other people do not separate religion from occultism. It's all one big mishmash, right? So obviously, it's occult in its own way.
Okay.
But it is a central text, and it's considered what we call Class A, which is Crowley has this whole very systematic way of classifying different texts that are relevant to Thelema. And Class A is kind of the divinely received or divinely inspired ones, where they are kind of beyond being changed, because it's the word of God essentially, right? You don't edit it. You may interpret it or figure things out, but it's kind of just this divine revelation, right? So there's other texts where he's writing in a more intellectual way or whatever else, where obviously it could be edited or changed, but it's almost like a different class of text itself. And that was in 1904. It was received. A lot of people don't know that the comment was written much later, decades later. So at least two decades later, it was put on there. And he tried to. There's part of the book that basically says, you will write a comment to this book, and he tried at least 3 times that I know of. And then there was this final comment that was very terse, right? So his other commentaries are basically line by line commentaries. This line means that. This line means that. This is a kind of a different breed. It was people think it itself is inspired, but he never really said the comment is class A. This is one of those kind of technical Thelemic discussions, but some people view the comment as part of that divinely inspired book. Other people as kind of like there's a divinely inspired book and then there's this comment. But I think there's a lot of context around the comment as well that people are not aware of, kind of historically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this guy named Norman Mudd that no one has ever heard of. But he was a really important Thelemite around the Abbey of Thelema era when Crowley was in Italy doing his Abbey of Thelema thing and doing crazy stuff.
Right.
And at one point, Norman Mudd kind of, as many occultists do, thinks they're the beast, right? So Norman
Right.
Mudd was like, I'm actually the beast, not you, Crowley. And so the context of this comment historically was Crowley basically being like, shut the hell up, Norman. I'm the beast, and you shouldn't listen to anyone about what the book means.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you decide for yourself, but you also reference my writings, my being Crowley, right? So there's that historical context as well that I think is important to understand, that Crowley, at least in that moment, what he said he was doing was trying to prevent other people setting themselves up as like essentially the Thelemic Pope, the one person that understands the one true Thelema or something like that, the true interpretation of Thelema.
And can then therefore go back and theoretically undo like all the stuff that he
Sure.
established in the Book of the Law. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so that actually sparked a question I had. I was hoping this would get brought up. So that this is probably not going to sound technical whatsoever, but like I understand that in certain texts in Hermeticism, there's I don't know the technical word, but there's like layers to the text basically, where like there's layers of meaning and coding into it, depending like what type of symbology or like what perspective you're approaching it with. Does Crowley like incorporate that into like the Book of the Law, and then theoretically like the comment? Like, are there layers of meaning to this?
Oh, absolutely. Whenever someone's like a new
For
Thelema,
sure.
I always tell them don't read the Book of the Law first. Maybe that's a hot take, but the Book of the Law does not make a lot of sense when you read it without any sort of context. It kind of just feels like, it doesn't really explain things directly in a way that people who are like, what is Thelema, really want to hear. I find that the Book of the Law is something that I read it. Each time I read it makes more sense to me, and I sort of get more of an interpretation from it. I don't think it's something like you read once and then immediately fully understand. I don't think I fully 100% understand every single nuance of it either.
Even Crowley said he didn't understand everything in it. So I think for us to understand it all, it's kind of hopeless, but we can try.
Yeah, and some people have. There's a blogger I really like. They're cool or mutuals on Instagram called Paradigm Grind, who did a line by line interpretation of it on their blog, which is the complete disregard of the comment. I feel like that's like sort of the extreme
Nice.
of the spectrum. And to be honest, it's actually pretty good. Like, I'll link it below. I really find it quite interesting because it's not exactly how I interpreted it, but it's
Right.
a very thorough job. But that is like sort of heresy to some people in a way because they take it very seriously. But something that's always entertained me is a lot of people disregard the whole "it is wise to destroy this copy after the first reading" part of that comment, but then apply the rest of the comment really extremely. And so it's like, why do you pick half of that as doctrine and the
Or
other half
like
is not? I've
even
always
the
found that a little interesting.
I've always, yeah. So one of my main points about the comment is that the comment requires interpretation to understand. Okay. So there are different ways to understand the comment, which is something that's really kind of run over by a lot of people. Like they're like, oh, we all understand what it means. We all agree what it means. No, that's not the case. And one of the things is if you take it really literally, it literally starts with the words "do what thou wilt," and it basically ends with the words "do what thou wilt," and in the middle it tells you to do all this stuff. So it's like, which one is it? There's no law beyond "do what thou wilt," or I have to do all this stuff as well. It doesn't really click. It doesn't make sense if you take it all literally. So people do a lot of this cherry picking stuff where it's like, well, this part makes, this part I will take literally, the rest is just metaphorical or something like that. It's very inconsistent, kind of cherry picking attitude. And I'm fine with cherry picking, to be honest, but when it's really uncritical and unexamined, like you just kind of don't think about it, and it's like, oh yeah, that's what everyone says, so that's how it is, and you don't really reflect on it. I think that's a big problem.
Which I think that's a community, like big tent, spirit, occult, metaphysical community problem. I think that we really do all sort of, I mean, we're all kind of cherry pickers. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think we do all have this idea where you can't question someone else's. And I don't mean like walking up to someone who's and being a fucking asshole and being like, "You are living your spiritual practice in peace. I am here to nitpick it." Like that's not what I mean. But I think when people are putting their ideas sort of in front of everyone, we have this idea that you can't ask questions or critique it because everyone's spirituality is legitimate. And I think it connects really strongly to this idea. And I think that in certain situations can kind of lead to some problems.
Yeah, I definitely think that one of the main messages I take from the comment is basically that in the end, everyone gets to decide for themselves about the law, that there is not a centralized authority that you have to conform with. But my opinion is also that we all think that way anyways. I mean, that's not a significant statement anymore. Pretty much all of our modern culture, even like corporate capitalistic culture, is based on this idea that everyone has their own way, everyone has their own thing. Man, it's not that crazy to say that everyone's interpretation is going to be different. That's basically a statement of fact. Like obviously, because everyone has a different perspective and is going to understand things differently, has different contexts, different experiences, different knowledge, blah blah blah. It's inevitable that they're all going to decide for themselves what it means. So in my view, it's true, but it's trivial. It's not even really worth saying because that's just going to be the case anyways. It is a nice kind of guard against the idea that there is one true way to interpret it. But as you asked earlier, it's actually understood that there's many layers of interpretation to the book itself. It's literally in the book saying, where is it? So it's like near the end, it says, the fool readeth this book of the law and its comment, and he understandeth it not. Let him come through the first ordeal, and it will be to him as silver, through the second, as gold, through the third, stones of precious water, through the fourth, ultimate sparks of intimate fire, which I pestilence here. I take that to mean there's at least 4 levels of interpreting this, right? You come through different ordeals, you come to different levels of spiritual insight, and the book kind of reveals itself or opens itself up in different ways. And aside from the book itself, Crowley's style is to have like 4 levels of meaning in everything he says, and one of them is always like a dick joke, right? And so it's like it's just the way he does things. It's the way he understands things. And I think the Book of the Law is really no different. There are many levels, and they're all simultaneously true in different ways, in different contexts. So, as if we understand that, then the idea that there's only one true interpretation isn't really going to happen anyways. And frankly, I think we have, as a culture, flipped too far from one side of the pendulum to the other, right? So like we come historically from like Christianity and orthodoxy within organized religion, and so it's a real danger to have people persecuting you for your interpretations. We've flipped basically to the mirror image of this on the completely other side, where everyone is totally on their own and you can't ever criticize their interpretation and you can't ever say anything about it. Everyone is doing their own thing, and just you shut up about your critiques, right? And frankly, like there's some good aspects to that, but it leads to a bunch of uncritical people who, if you never have your beliefs challenged, you're inevitably going to have this kind of narcissistic philosophy that's just brewed in your own head, and everything's going to be a reflection of your own beliefs to begin with. And so that, unfortunately, I think has infected a lot of the Thelemic community, um, where it's framed as a strength that we let everyone interpret things for themselves, but in practice, it's basically a way of like batting away any kind of criticism of your views or batting away any kind of critique of the underlying philosophy without you needing to reflect on it. Like, is this actually true, or is there another way? Maybe I'm actually, wrong about this. There's like one tweet where I'm like, the Thelemites' worst nightmare is someone telling them that they might be wrong about something. It's just like, God forbid someone says you might be wrong about something. It's very fragile to me, and I don't really like the vibe.
Which is really funny because Thelemites have this view, but at the same time, there's like this nitpicking culture in Thelema over small things. Like, especially like when it comes to blah blah blah. Like, if you have an attribution slightly wrong, everyone sort of,
Right.
gets quite upset. I've had this issue with my pronunciation because I have a bad tendency of pronouncing
Hmm.
things wrong, and
Like
I will
Crowley,
admit that.
yeah.
Yeah, I pronounce a lot of things incorrectly. I call it the reader's accent. Um, this is the late stage solitary practitioner. It's
Hmm.
very terminal at this point.
You're absolutely right, though, that it's something that for some reason I wasn't fully able to grasp this until somewhat lately, which is that people are just overt hypocrites about this, where it's everyone interprets everything for themselves and no one can tell you what Thelema is. But the second someone implies that true will means you do what you want, these exact same people will be like stepping on your face and like stepping all over you to be like, no, will is not want. That's not the right interpretation of the book of the law. You can't interpret it that way. And it's the exact same people. And it's totally inconsistent. It's totally hypocritical. Um, Obviously, my view is that there should be different ways of interpreting this debated. And at the very least, you should admit that there are maybe not wrong interpretations, but that there's kind of a narrow field within which you can interpret. Like the idea that nuit in the book of the law actually represents, like, I don't know, my dirty shoe, right? And like true will represents going to, I don't know, going to Paraguay, right? Why? That's absurd. That's not what the book is about at all. So clearly there's room for interpretation, but there's also like all this space where the interpretations make no friggin' sense, and they do not cohere with anything Crowley said, for example.
Okay.
So
I'm so sorry. Please go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, like, within that, then, like, it's hard for me to imagine that, like, because Crowley worked on this for basically his entire life, like founding Thelema and putting the foundation in place for people. And so, like, I can't imagine at some point it should have dawned on him at least that, like, these potential problems could come up, like just setting this ambiguous language, which could then suggest to people, like, you can just do whatever the hell you want. And, like, it almost seems like he built some of these conflicts into the text, like, to be overcome like on a personal level, but like the community is not handling it very well. And so, like, you brought up the point, like, there's a narrow margin of space where, like, like, you can nuance it to a point, but like we're still all generally talking about the same thing if you're reading the
Right.
text accurately. And so, like, what are your guys' interpretation of like the comment, for example?
Oh, my personal take is that it's a test.
Hmm.
Like, the entire book is about doing your will, and then it gives you dogmatic instruction. That's how I've always viewed it. That's my personal take.
I'm pretty much on the same page there, where like I said, it starts by saying, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." It ends by saying, "There is no law beyond do what thou wilt." And then the other line is, "The study of this book is forbidden." Wait, so all books in the world ever are fair game, but this is one book I can't study and I can't discuss with other people? That's such obvious bullshit. And then, whoso disregards this does so at his own risk and peril. And it's like the entire book of the law is about, conflict and war and strength and courage. And now we're worried about some risk and peril. Like, who cares? And then, the book, people who discuss this are to be shunned by all. And it's like, I'm not going to shun people just because you tell me to do it, no matter what the condition is. That seems like a very childish, like, it's basically, are you a kind of person that still needs to take commandments from other people to live your life? Then you're probably going to destroy the book, and it's self-correcting in that way, where it's like, well, all the people who are dumb and take things literally, they're gonna destroy the book, and then we won't have to worry about them. People who are afraid about risk and peril, they won't discuss it, and so we don't have to hear their dumb ideas anyway, right? I think that's, personally, I don't know that Crowley had this in mind, because there's nowhere where he wrote this, but functionally, the way it's worked, and the way I read it, as I just explained, it seems like it's a pretty strong interpretation. But I should say there are many ways of interpreting this comment. Even certain lines can be. I've heard probably like 4 or 5 interpretations of every single line. And one of my big points is the meaning of the comment is not explicitly obvious. It's not. It's not so simple as, just something that can be taken literally. There requires some level of interpretation in the comment. So when it says, basically you can interpret the whole book for yourself, each for himself, well, so also for the comment, right? People can interpret that as they will as well.
And a lot of people do take it to the most level of literalness, because I know quite a few people who work at metaphysical stores who have told me that every now and again they get someone who buys a copy of this. I find this version is the one that shops tend to have, and then they come back like 3 weeks later and buy a second. I've had quite a few people message me telling me that they have destroyed their copy. Almost all have burnt it. And then sometimes they'll message me and they'll be like, "Why did you not do the same? I see you holding the same book." Because you can tell like the corner's getting a little messed up. That's clearly the same copy. Why are you doing this? And I've had other people message me and go, "Wait, I realized I probably shouldn't have done that," etc., etc., etc. And so there definitely are people who kind of take it that level of serious, and I find that a very interesting phenomenon on its
Well,
own of the
oh,
the destruction of it.
well, I mean, it reminds me of what you were saying a few minutes ago about like the cherry picking aspects of it, because like the first line literally says like the study of this book is forbidden, and so like if you're going to be hyper literal about it, like, and take it to the point where you would destroy the first copy, but then go back to the store and get another one a couple weeks later, like you're already cherry picking, like you're disregarding at least some of the wisdom in
That's
there.
right. That's right. Yeah. Now that I think about it, you could destroy your first copy and then go back, and I guess that's okay. But you're not allowed to study it. So it's
Yeah,
just
not
like
study
it
it.
does. It doesn't make.
So you can read it a
It's
few
for your
times
bookcase. Yeah.
but not think about it. Yeah, it's for the aesthetic, be like, "Ooh,
Exactly.
I have an edgy book."
Yeah. Crowley was the first aesthetic occultist.
Yes,
Oh my
that's
goodness.
the real interpretation of the Book of the Law, guys. Pack it up. No more Thelema at this point. We figured it out. I
Mm-hmm.
just find it's also very interesting to me how the Thalemic personality, because I've noticed Thelemites tend to have a very specific personality range. There's this sort of stubbornness. There's this rugged individualism. This kind of almost aggression sometimes. I find that we have like a very specific set of traits, and I think that that is kind of partially why you'd be gravitated to this stuff. But I find it so interesting that those people are the ones who are sometimes so rigid about the comment.
It's kind of like narcissism in general, where from the outside it looks like they're big and strong, but really they're actually very fragile and protective, right? So, in other words, I think a lot of Thelemites are narcissists. um, but it's the same thing. It really is, where you just talk a good game. You're like, oh, we're soldiers of freedom, and we believe in do what thou wilt, and all these other like weak philosophies like Wicca are not manly, like Thelema is. But oh my god, you criticized me on Twitter once, and I'm gonna like crumple and like I'm gonna shake and cry for the rest of the night. Like, give me a freaking break here. It's clearly an excuse for you to feel powerful, but not in a genuine way, not in an authentic way. It's something I posted recently where it's in Thelema, we should encourage things that make people stronger. Not physically stronger, that's cool too, but mentally, spiritually stronger, where you can take criticism. You can hear someone criticize you right to your face or insult you right to your face, and you're like, okay, I hear that, maybe there's something to consider in there, but you don't just like completely fall apart. I think the spirit behind Thelema is one of strength. I think that's a pretty conventional view, actually. But my view of strength is not one where you talk a big game. It's where you actually have a kind of mental fortitude and to really tackle difficult questions. Like the most difficult questions are where your preferred ideology are being questioned in really serious and critical ways, right? So really, in my opinion is a lot of people come to this philosophy because on the outside it gives you the language to say you're a king and you're the coolest person on earth and you're the center of the universe and all that. Yeah, all narcissists believe those things too. There's something a little more to it than just the words or the appearance of being a big strong dude or something like that.
I think just a lot of people, they get into spirituality, spiritual, occult, Thelema, etc. And they get really upset when anyone disagrees with them. I see this a lot with people in sort of the my age range who are, say, especially if they're like witchy, they're newer, they get really upset when everyone doesn't immediately think their beliefs are correct. Or if someone is like, paganism isn't real or something like that. And they like lose their mind and they're like, oh my God, I'm being attacked. And I'm like, if you have a fringe belief set, not everyone's going to agree with you. This like comes with the territory. Like if you're a Thelemite, not everyone's going to agree with you. There are going to be people who are completely turned off from the beliefs. And I think that we as a culture can't handle that sometimes, but it's something you need to accept if you have any sort of more niche views in any way, any part of life, to be honest.
That's actually one of the interpretations of the comment. To bring it back is, study is forbidden. Whoever disregards this does so at his own risk and peril. Some people think that means Crowley was saying, if you study Thelema, if you do what is forbidden and you study this and you become a Thelemite, you probably will be viewed as a center of pestilence. You'll probably be shunned by other people. You'll probably be viewed as there'll be some risk and peril. People have literally lost their jobs over being Thelemites. It's a real thing. So that is one interpretation of the comment, is that taking on this philosophy in a real way actually does put you at some risk, at least in the sense of social acceptability. Not that that's like our biggest concern, but I think it is a valid interpretation of at least that aspect of the comment.
And that social acceptance thing, I mean, it is something that affects people pretty personally. Like a lot of people are, especially right now, there's a lot of anti-Thelema sentiment in the sort of younger spaces of the community. People are like using the word cancel in a serious way, but people are really going hard against it. And so people who are, openly identifying as Thelemites, they're like, Crowley did bad things. And they assume that like you are responsible for the actions of Crowley, and so they'll like directly critique you as that. And so a lot of people are like, I know some other creators are like, I really don't want to talk about this stuff publicly because I'm gonna get people, replying to me, accusing me of these. What they'll do is they like to throw like the worst out of context Crowley quotes at you and say, do you agree with this? And then if you say no, they're like, well, you still follow the philosophy, thus you are accountable for it somehow, which is an absurd
Yeah.
idea on its face, to be honest. But,
Yeah.
that type of stuff is happening even within the esoteric community. Like, these are in community people who will do it. And so, even in our spaces, like, if you're super open about this stuff, people do get mad at you. And
It's really, I honestly think it's just kind of a microcosm of the greater macrocosm of our culture right now, especially among, I don't even know what to call it, like liberals or this kind of whatever I say, I'm going to probably be canceled for it. But it's this going overboard with purity politics and doing these kind of gotcha things, like, oh, you agree with this quote, like, okay, you're canceled, like you're on the list of bad people that have done bad things, and we know we don't have to listen to you anymore. It's like this really hyper simplistic view of justice, where if someone says something that you can twist in a certain way to be not what's acceptable in this current week's acceptability list, you're gone forever. And that clearly has infected the occult community as well. And just to be clear, I very much support social justice However, I think when you do things like trying to cancel a Thelema because of something Crowley says, you're trivializing these issues. You're basically making the issue into something that doesn't matter, right? And so when something happens that does actually matter, say there's an actual freaking Nazi out there saying something, people from the outside, it kind of looks the same. Like you're canceling this person for a quotation that they kind of agree with, and then there's a Nazi, and it's like in reality they're worlds apart. But by virtue of you being uncritical in your canceling of people, you essentially level the playing field. It makes it look like everything is the same. And it's a big problem in our society at large as well, that people don't seem to distinguish between these things anymore. And people who have good intentions are lumped in with people who are clearly acting in bad faith. And so it's an issue like all across the board. Like if a woman makes a false accusation of sexual assault, that trivializes the real accusations that are made against people. It's the same principle. And so these people that are on Twitter or YouTube comments or even in real life, these people really exist, unfortunately. But I actually think they think they're fighting for the cause, but in reality, in practice, they're actually undermining it in a significant way. And like it's you take a step back, it's ridiculous that Crowley says something that you're going to cancel a person because they think about it or something, or maybe they agree with it. This idea that people need to be completely ignored or shunned because their ideas are simply different is bizarre to me.
Yeah, and I mean, this opens to a broader Thelemic issue, but like, very few Thelemites blindly agree with everything Crowley said. I mean, I don't know if any of us do. I'm sure there's one or two people. I'll give those people
They're out there.
their attention. The Crowleyites listening to this podcast, you are valid uwu. But I think the vast majority, I hate myself for saying that. I think the vast majority of Thelemites do not blindly agree with everything associated with Thelema.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you, for whatever your paradigm is, dear listener, do that, maybe don't. Maybe ask questions about your own beliefs, because that's kind of important to do and good practice.
And something, if I can interject, something that you brought up that I was really happy you brought it up was this idea between like social media cancel culture started as something like a tool for good. It was a way of like handing power back to like the masses and being able to hold content creators or public figures accountable for like their shitty views, especially when they make them on a public forum. But we've evolved to this point where like everyone's very reactionary about everything. And like thank you for bringing that up, like, because I think that's where the nuance within this discussion lies. Like, I don't know a lot about how this operates within the Thelemic community, but we touched a little bit on like the greater esoteric community, especially like witchcraft spaces. Like I wanted to bring this up earlier, but I didn't get a chance. There was something, Georgina, you said about I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but what it brought to mind was how Temp always used to talk about there used to be this edge to the witchcraft community where like people were okay with being rebellious. Like it was known that it was a
Yeah.
counterculture. People were okay with like they understood that there was a social stigma that was going to be associated with it, and that you'd have to have conviction in your beliefs, and like in a way that fostered our community. But like nowadays, I know we've talked about this before. It could be just like the push of individualism within Gen Z. It could be like the political spectrum, like any number of problems created this. Now we've kind of shifted, like you said, to the opposite polarity of that, where now like nobody wants to step on anybody's toes. Everyone wants to make the entire, like, I'm very, very leftist, so I hate using this word, but like everyone wants to make the community very PC. Like we've taken inclusivity to the point of like how did Nike describe this? Nike described it one time as basically like horseshoe theory. Like we become so progressive
Cursed
and
horseshoe theory.
yeah, cursed horseshoe theory. Like you become so progressive that you loop back around to like we were talking about cultural appropriation. You become so progressive on canceling people for cultural appropriation that you then become xenophobic, and you start drawing all these lines between like races.
Somehow you're back at racial purity again.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the best example of that is the Roma tarot thing. Roma did not invent tarot.
Right, and now it has gone the
Saying
full
it belongs
gamut
to
from,
the
like
Roma is racist.
Yeah, exactly.
That
But,
discourse is, I think, the worst one because it's the
mhm,
idea is that if you read tarot, you're appropriating the Roma, but the Roma never invented tarot,
mhm.
so
Well, and that's what it goes back to
it's
is, like,
terrible.
it's a reactionary tendency to, like, try to fight for social justice without actually having the context and the facts and, like, understanding, like you were saying, what the problem actually is, like, at its root, and, like you were saying again, it trivializes actual problems when they do surface, and so, like, are there mechanisms in place within, like, the Thelemic community example that, like,
Well,
check this? Like, are
the
there
comment is, like, the perfect microcosm of this because you're so obsessed with individualism that it becomes a new conformity. Like, you've done the thing where you're so anti-orthodox, you've just made a new orthodoxy. Like, you're repeating the same mistake, but
Right.
inversed,
Yeah, it's like on
basically.
South Park where everyone's like, "I'm a nonconformist," but they're all saying it together, right? Like, it's like,
Yeah.
wait a second. They're really, as far as I can tell, there's no like check in the greater Thelemic community against this, except for like really grumpy people like myself, kind of like posting on Twitter and being like, "This sucks," and that's about it. There's obviously some things within certain organizations, but I personally think maybe this is a little controversial or something, but I spent 10 or plus years in OTO. I think OTO is, in the people that are authorities within OTO are the primary purveyors of this kind of hypocritical attitude toward the comment. It's something I was inundated with throughout my time in the OTO, and I always kind of, frankly, I took it without much thinking as well. Where it's like, oh yeah, people who discuss the Book of the Law, they're trying to set themselves up as Thelemic Pope, and as I got some distance from that, it's literally the opposite. People who
Mhm.
generally, I mean, obviously, there's some people out there who think they're Crowley reincarnated and they have the true interpretation, but fuck them, they're stupid, right? Who cares?
I don't
Um,
listen to anyone the second their sentence starts with, "I am the reincarnation of Crowley." That is where I
right.
hit the mute button.
That's what the comment should say. If you are a reincarnation of Crowley, nothing you say matters, right?
Yes.
Uh, that would have been a good comment.
Oh my
But
goodness.
my sense is that people talking about the central text of your philosophy, the central text of your religion, whatever you want to call it, people talking about that, discussing different points of view.
Mhm.
The OTO view is that discussing this creates dogma. It's literally the opposite of that. When in the history of the world has different people coming together with different ideas and sharing different viewpoints increased dogma? It's
Right.
the exact opposite. It's actually this kind of this shroud of silence where you're not allowed to officially comment. It's allowed a new what my friend, I guess I could say, it's called consensus Thelema, right? A new consensus has emerged kind of out of the shadows because they won't admit that it's really actually a dogmatic interpretation.
Mhm.
And my view is that more people talking about this, more people debating this, more people having critical views, having other experiences, and bringing in those experiences into their interpretations, that widens people's views. Whereas everyone is so afraid that it's going to constrict into this tiny little dogma, but in practice, it's the exact opposite. And it blows my mind that this has itself become a dogma within Thelema, that people who want to critically evaluate the Book of the Law are the ones creating dogma. No, they're the ones challenging the dogmas.
And an aside for those listening, OTO is the largest Thelemic organization, but it is still the minority of Thelemic people.
That's right.
I can't get statistics on this. I've tried doing as much research as I
I
theoretically
could make some
can.
up if you want.
Yeah. Well, our fake statistics say, but I do genuinely believe the majority of Thelemites are not part of the OTO, but the OTO is the biggest group. And they are, a lot of people consider them an authority on Thelema. People have a lot of mixed opinions on the OTO. That is a whole long conversation, but
Yeah, that's why I said it might be controversial. But I think it's unambiguously true that the vast majority of Thelemites have nothing to do with OTO.
Yeah.
I think that's just a fact.
It's what happens when you have a super kind of I think that the Thelemic philosophy kind of makes sense for solitary people in a lot of ways. I think it works very well as a solitary practice if you are that type. Obviously, organizations are valid or whatever, but that is, I think I need to clarify that because if someone didn't know what OTO was,
I forgot. Yeah, people don't know that. Yeah. Um, yeah. OTO is basically like the church of Thelema. At least in
yeah,
America, it's very much the church of Thelema.
that's probably a good
Um,
way to
it's the
very
I used to
briefly
call it
explain the.
Wizard Church. So it's basically where people go to dress up as a priest and a priestess and do Thelemic rituals and such, and drink a lot of wine and have a good time. You know, I really have nothing against the local bodies of OTO and people doing that kind of stuff. But people who get into the higher levels and pretend like they're authorities on Thelema, those are the kind of people I'm talking about who really have this bizarre idea that people having different perspectives shared about the book of the law is somehow a recipe for dogma, when really it's actually the other way around, where their kind of superficial silence has allowed them to create dogmas without seeming that
And
that's
it
what's happening.
and being unable to criticize things creates problems whenever there is like an actual issue in the community. You know, like if something actually bad happens in the Thelemic community, if we have this much like we need to stay silent attitude at all times, whenever those issues emerge, it's harder to discuss them. And I think that that's a very not good thing to have in a community.
That's a really important point. I personally have suffered, I guess. But the thing is if everything is valid, then a Thelema where you're a Nazi and you're going to exterminate minorities, you can't criticize that because everyone has their own valid path. That is so absurd on its face. That is so obviously against the basic principles of Thelema. And OTO in particular teaches that you're a soldier of freedom that fights against superstition, tyranny, and oppression. How can you do that if nothing is possible to be criticized, if everything is valid? Everything is not valid. When people view you as subhuman, that is not valid, and you should fight against that. So, this keep silence, everything is valid, it very much allows that to grow. It allows those things to flourish. Crowley actually has a quotation that was the paradox of intolerance before Karl Popper invented that idea, which is that we are infinitely tolerant, save of intolerance. Right? It's kind of a clever way of talking about it, but it's like all these viewpoints are cool, except for these guys over here that are intolerant of everyone and want to kill everyone because of their skin color or whatever. Right? There are people that sabotage the entire enterprise. The exact same idea in a garden where you don't let the weeds grow because they kill the flowers, right? They kill the other plants. Is that intolerant? I guess, but it's intolerant of those particular intolerant strains, the weeds, right?
Well, and for me, the thing where the nuance comes in for me is like you have to consider what you're trying to protect in like those circumstances, or like what you're trying to build. And like with the paradox of intolerance, it's about like creating like a safe space. You want to create a safe space of inclusivity, but then in order to maintain that, you have to protect it by maintaining, like you were saying, some of those restrictions to people who would come in and break it. And like it strikes to mind for me something I would imagine in Thelema. I don't know a lot about actual Thelemic teaching, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like I would imagine in Thelema, like the core thing you're trying to go after is like your ability to pursue your true will. And so therefore, like in a community context, the thing you're trying to build or create is an environment where everyone can go and pursue their true will without inhibiting anyone else's ability to go and pursue their true will. So like is that a part of Thelema? Like does Crowley or anyone else ever talk about like that? Like it's important to like not inhibit like other people's ability to follow their true will?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it is. I think a lot of modern culture has taken that as a particularly important point. But Crowley framed that specifically in this idea of mind your own business, in the sense of you do your own will and let other people do their will. And a lot of people take that to the extreme now, where it's like you have a critique, you have something critical to say, you're not minding your own business. And it's like, well, you mind your own business, you know? But I think the spirit of it is pretty obvious. It's exactly what you say, that the ideal is a community or a society that promotes you finding your will and allowing other people the freedom to find their will. And that seems pretty simple to me, but unfortunately, it seems like people take this, like I said, to the extreme. They really flip to the other side of the pendulum, and this infinite license for everything also includes people who say things that are really dumb, things that are completely unfounded. People say things that are fascist, whatever, and the idea that you can never push back on that, you can never be critical of that, is itself obviously restrictive. But unfortunately, the culture has kind of trended in this way that, like I said, is a reflection of our greater culture of this hypersensitivity over ever telling someone that they might be wrong about something.
Yeah, and a good time, just a quick note, in terms of critiquing someone, if someone's just like there, don't like walk up to them and try to argue with them. It's if they're presenting their ideas in the open. Like, don't be an asshole about critiquing people. Obviously, I think debate and discussion is important. I do all this for that purpose, but be kind of polite about how you go about these things. I'm a big believer in the mantra, and I've said it on the show a bunch of times: attack ideas, not people.
And
And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I'm Jewish by heritage, and when I say something on like Twitter, for example, and people react like they're being oppressed because someone on the internet has said something, it is absurd. You have
Yeah.
no sense of what oppression is. If someone disagreeing with you on the internet is your standard for what is unacceptably oppressive behavior, that's
Mm-hmm.
frankly pathetic in my view. It's weak and it's pathetic, and it does not conform to the spirit, at least, of Thelema, which is one of creativity and of strength. And if you
Mm-hmm.
can't take some words on your phone or your TV screen, then you are frankly not suited for this philosophy or the world, really. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
really, it's something that I've seen with people who are very well versed in Thelema, like decades of study, and it
yeah.
concerns me as a in the sense of the general direction of the current or the culture of Thelema. Because if that is what takes over, I want nothing to do with it,
Well,
frankly.
at that point, is it even Thelema? So, my final thoughts are that if you're going to follow a philosophy, religion, paradigm, whatever you want to call Thelema, okay? We're not going to have that debate right now because it's a final thought. I don't have time for that. But whatever you consider Thelema, if you can't handle someone disagreeing with you, why are you here? If you can't understand that maybe you shouldn't rigidly follow everything that someone tells you, including things that I say, please critique me, disagree with me, be nice about it. But like, don't blindly listen to people if you're going to follow philosophy, religion, paradigm, etc., 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 about following your own will. I think you should internalize this whole idea of will and think about it and maybe interpret that as like, I'm not going to blindly listen to everything I'm told, and I'm going to think critically about it and ask questions and be okay with disagreeing and understand that it is possible to be wrong. And when you are wrong, the best way to accept being wrong is to change your view, be honest about it, and not dig your feet in for however long you want to.
I think my final thought is going to be, regardless of whether or not you are a part of the Thelema community or you're just a regular practitioner, wherever you fall along the spectrum, um, be aware. I guess my final thought is be aware that echo chambers can be very poisonous, especially to a spiritual practice, especially one that exists in this community context that we have. And so be mindful of that. Remember that outside opinions can help us to grow personally, and our own experiences can help other people to grow. None of this has to be inherently, how am I trying to say this? Like, none of this interaction has to be inherently aggressive. Like, we can foster a space of growth within this community. I've seen it happen tons of times in many different ways. And this recent push towards just canceling or arguing or screaming at whatever we don't like on the internet. Like, that is a trend, like we've said, that is a trend going on within the greater macrocosm that is echoing into our microcosm of this community, and it's not going to stop until we become aware of that. So just try to be a little more understanding of where people are coming from on the internet, be a little more conscientious of how your words are being purveyed on the internet, and take everything with a grain of salt.
Dang. Okay, my final thoughts are I wish Anthony and Georgina were not so articulate, because it's going to make me look bad. You guys are making me look bad. No, my final thoughts are that if your central philosophy, if your central paradigm is not capable of withstanding critique, if you personally are not, if your philosophy has put you in a position where someone saying you might be wrong or someone saying there's another perspective is somehow threatening to you, then you might want to reconsider that philosophy. In my opinion, if something does not make you a stronger person, a more resilient person, I don't care what it is, Thelema or whatever, then it's probably not good for you. All right. And if you're using that philosophy to deflect criticism, to not self reflect, to not think about the assumptions you've made, then you're using that to essentially spiritually bypass. You're using that to avoid dealing with your own issues, to avoid dealing with the realities of life, to avoid dealing with the fact that there are other people out there with other experiences that disagree with you. And if your philosophy is based on self-enforced ignorance, then it's not a great philosophy, Thelema or not.
Perfect. So I would like to thank our patrons. If you are in the $10 tier or higher, we will read your name out every single week. So thank you to Sarah.Nihilus, Brigid, Sociology of Tarot, Lita, Hamda, Lilith Surrenda, Kelly, Marcello, The Lady Ghost, Leo, Jonah, I'm very good at this, Nicole, Neon, Rowan, Marshall, Nauseated, MK Scorpio 89, Alejandra, Jessica, Victoria, Angry Pratt, Doitsu, Amy, Anna, and Evan. Thank you guys so much. If you join our Patreon, you get early access, extended shows, video versions, pre-shows, and lots of... Oh, you get extra episodes allegedly every Sabbath or so. Emphasis on allegedly. This has been Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, and I have my own Patreon. I'm pretty much everywhere, generally. So find me places. And I stream with Nike, the missing host who has tragically died for this week alone, on Twitch every Monday and Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. EST.
I am Anthony Wolfe. If you want to connect with me, I am on Instagram or on Twitter as @AnthonyTheWitch, and that is about the only cool stuff that I do.
Do I talk or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can plug yourself.
You can plug wherever you want to.
Sweet. Okay, I'm IAO131, but it is spelled IAO131, just to make things complicated for you. So IAO131.com. I also run the website Thelemic Union, so ThelemicUnion.com if you want to see a bunch of articles by different people giving different perspectives. Then you can go to that website. That's pretty much all I got.
And this has been Magnolias and Magic.